Welcome to MSUA's Game Changers Live, where we speak with satellite and mobile connectivity thought leaders about industry trends, new technologies, and tell you what you need to know about the future of satellite communications. I'm your host, Lisa Dreer, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest for today, Chris Quilty. He's with Quilty Analytics. I am proud to welcome you to the show, Chris.
Thanks, Lisa. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Maybe we can start by having you give a little bit of background on yourself and Quilty Analytics.
My background, I started 25 years ago at Raymond James, a financial services firm, as a stock analyst, writing research. Think of the buy sell ratings on stocks for public companies that you see in the news all the time. About 10 to 15 years ago, or I guess in the mid 2000s, I shifted my focus from what had been on the defense sector to the space industry. and It's kind of an interesting time to write on space companies because, well, the industry had just gone bankrupt, less than a decade earlier. There wasn't a lot of activity, but lo and behold, by 2016, the industry was looking pretty promising, a lot of growth. And I stepped out on my own, hung my own shingle, and Quilty Analytics today is a focus shop. There's about a dozen of us, including some outside advisors we use. And we're 100% focused on the satellite and space industry, everything from ground equipment to the satellite operators and everything that goes in between that, launch and satellite manufacturing, to all the downstream services that happen. We publish research, some of which goes out complimentary, and it's a subscription model because I do have to pay the kids' bills. We also, my partner was my investment banker at Raymond James. And so we do traditional investment banking work in mergers and acquisitions and private placements and capital raising. We are based down in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is why I have my shirt on, because that's where Raymond James was located. And thought of moving up to DC to be closer to the hub of the space industry, or at least where the money flows from. But it's a 20-minute flight to the airport, and it's sunny and the palm trees are blowing. Not that I'm teasing you people who are not here, but just saying.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know, 30 some degrees in Seattle today. So yeah, don't rub it in.
And rainy.
No, it's sunny for
Oh,
now.
good.
We'll see how long that lasts. Well, in any case, we invited you here today to talk a little bit about where mobile connectivity is going and how satellite industry is playing a role in that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what you feel the most important role or roles are that the satellite industry is going to play in the future of mobile connectivity.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. It's connecting the unconnected, right? There are certain things that terrestrial technologies are good for, and if you need high bandwidth and concentrated locations of people and connectivity, whether it's fiber or terrestrial towers, I mean, it works well. Uh, Pick your number. Is it 10 or 15% of the Earth's surface is covered by cellular networks? The balance will only be connected by satellite. And fortunately, we're seeing a lot of progress with new satellite technologies, new architectures like LEO, new hardware that I think the amount and number of people that are connected in the future is going to grow substantially thanks to satellite.
Great, great. What do you think are some of the most significant changes that we'll see in the next 3 to 5 years?
Um, so I think the biggest story and one that sort of came out of nowhere last year was the emergence of this trend in what I call direct to device technology. And this is the idea, what people used to think of as the holy grail or fairy dust, depending on your opinion, of being able to connect directly from a satellite to a consumer device, your iPhone, your Android device. It's always been a problem because, well, phones weren't designed to connect to satellites in space, and satellites were not built to connect with it. Uh, there had been a handful of companies that had been promoting this, most notably Link and AST. But last year was a breakout. I can't think of a company that didn't announce an initiative from the traditional MSS companies like Global Star and Iridium to new entrants, companies like SpaceX that are building a 5 by 5 meter antenna onto their second gen satellites to enable T-Mobile and surely other international MNOs to get connectivity from space.
Yeah. So how is it a reality? Like, is this actually happening right now, or how far off do you think we are?
Well, on paper, right, this should work. I think we have seen early examples. Link has shown demonstrations. In fact, even the Global Star Apple initiative, which is extremely limited, based upon Global Star's legacy satellites, they've shown that it's work. I saw a news story where some dude drove off a cliff. It happens to all of us, right?
Yeah.
And he was stranded, and he was able to use that service. As creaky as it is, there's some evidence that the technology could work, but it's going to take time and effort. I think when the original OneWeb SpaceX announcements happened back in 2015, I was one of those naysayers, really based upon the financial challenges of building those systems, that hey, this is never going to happen. And look, I'll eat crow. We think now that there will be 3, 4, maybe 5 of these LEO broadband systems. So never say never.
Yeah. Well, that's really exciting. So I'm hoping that it becomes mainstream sooner rather than later. There's a lot of talk, I think, in the satellite industry over the last couple of years about going more toward a standards-based approach and away from proprietary systems and solutions. How do you, I guess, what's your take on that?
Well, we have standards, right? I mean, there's
Well,
the DVB S2X extension, right? Those standards have been around for a while, but yeah, I mean, the reality is you can't take an iDirect modem and put it into a Hughes network. The Global Star spot device does not work on an Iridium network. Some of this is due to the fact that there are different frequencies, that are used, and these are all licensed frequencies. Certainly in the MSS world, each company owns its own proprietary slice of spectrum. So it gets really hard to get to standards because nobody's going to share their spectrum. When you look at some of the LEO systems that exist out there, I mean, there is shared spectrum in KU and in KA. And so there is a need for spectrum. And I guess what I would say is there had never been a driving motivation for companies in this industry to play together, because once you build your sandbox, with steep little walls, you can just live in that sandbox and continue to sell into your customer base. And it gets really hard, to switch customers. And I think what may change that for the first time ever are these new 3GPP standards coming out of the terrestrial wireless world. So up until this point, the terrestrial wireless guys, honestly, they just didn't give a crap about satellite. There was no desire, no need to integrate terrestrial wireless with satellite. The new standards, I guess specifically the release 17 that were recently approved, is the first time that I know of that the terrestrial wireless world has written in NTN or non-terrestrial networks into the standards. Now the question is, can vendors choose to add on, proprietary add-ons or waveforms or, extensions that, will again sort of create walls? Well, I would say if the outcome of these new standards are that, companies have to adhere, right? If you want to go after, that 5G backhaul, cellular backhaul station, you're not going to be able to do your own proprietary stuff, because those telecom providers are going to want standards-based equipment providers. So, knock on wood, I think we may be at a bit of a turning point. That creates risk, right? Because a lot of the traditional moats that people have built around their business with proprietary standards go away. But there's also opportunity because there's a much bigger pie in terms of the terrestrial applications and services and partners that start to open up to the satellite industry.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, I think we're in one of the most dramatic times of change and shift and commercialization of space. All of these things are kind of happening all at the same time. And as you mentioned, there's this kind of direct to space coming into, or direct to device coming into the market as well. You know, how do you see, I guess, regulatory and allocation of, you know, uh, of the satellite, area? So, like, how are we going to deal with all that, right? And I know that there's, SpaceX has made a play for some S-band allocation and things like that. How is all of that going to play out, or how do you think it's going to play out?
Oh, it's going to be a cat fight. It'll be fun to watch because I'm just sitting up in the bleachers watching it. But yeah, I mean, what we've seen are traditional alliances, traditional models are falling apart by the wayside. And maybe I'll just use an example. Some of the things that have happened in the traditional fixed satellite world, which was a bit of a club of the big four satellite operators that were able to just distribute cell transponders into their channel and didn't really have to focus as much on the end application that was left up to their partners. But as you move towards high throughput satellites where you're not selling transponders, you're selling a mobility service across a series of spot beams. And whereas new entrants come into the market, like name names, Viasat and Inmarsat going direct into the in-flight connectivity, it's forced the legacy providers to change their go-to-market strategies to the companies that they partner with, to the solutions that they offer. I guess the other aspect of this is how the traditional industry deals with, partners with, or competes with these new LEO broadband systems.
Mhm.
Look, in some ways, they couldn't be any more different, right? A Starlink system has a very expensive, very relatively large antenna that's designed for broadband. That's very different than what Iridium or Globalstar is doing in terms of a very small, mobile, lower bandwidth solution.
Mhm.
So there's not necessarily a situation where it's all competition. I think there are different solutions for different applications, but I think a lot of the traditional alignments in terms of partnerships and distribution strategies are going to change pretty dramatically over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. When you think about the enterprise user community, what do they need to be taking into account as they consider the partners that they're going to work with now and then into the future?
Oh goodness, that's a big question, right? I think a question that a lot of people are asking. I mean, I do often when I do a presentation for different audiences, I have a particular slide that the title is "Disruption is Everywhere." And it's not only technology or partnerships or distribution, it's funding sources, the emergence of venture capital and new entrants into the market, the regulatory environment. It's a very difficult environment, I think, for companies to navigate,
Mhm.
and choose your slice. I mean, the operators themselves are seeing new entrants and new technologies. If you were a geo provider, now you're dealing with LEOs and MEOs and other architectures. If you were a systems integrator or service provider in the industry, take in the maritime segment, which 10 years ago was sort of Inmarsat only, and then you had this flood of VSAT technologies that have come in, and now you're seeing Starlink, and eventually probably Kuiper and OneWeb coming into that market. And that means not only different service providers, but also different architectures and antenna systems that are needed in order to provision the service. So I think you have to have a very agile learning organization, one that's curious and not dismissive, right, about things that are being proposed, because I have been dismissive in the past and proven wrong.
Yeah.
So, drop the blinders, look at opportunities, and what's difficult for all of us, trying to predict the future, who the winners are going to be and who you need to align with.
Yeah. So you brought up OneWeb and Kuiper, and I guess, do you think that SpaceX or Starlink has such a head start that will, I guess, hamper the success of the later comers, or do you think there's room for everybody in the market?
Um, well, look, I think I said it earlier. I think there will be 3 or 4 or maybe 5 survivors in these non-geo constellations. Is it because the world? I mean, broadband. If we're talking about broadband, uh,
Hmm.
which is primarily what these LEO systems do, the new LEO, not the old LEOs, right? The new LEOs are all about broadband. Broadband's a commodity, right? End of the
Hmm.
day. How many, what data rate are you going to give me and what price? So
Yeah.
from that perspective, if, latecomers, have a better solution than SpaceX, then they'll win, right?
Yeah.
The switching costs are something because the antennas are not cheap, but they're being subsidized. Now, all that said, if I'm telling you it's a commodity and all that matters is price, and yet I'm also telling you there's going to be 3 or 4 providers, why is that? And I think it's because the motivation of the players are different. SpaceX famously, why did they choose to compete with their primary customers? Which are the geo satellite operators whose satellites they launch, and compete with them with a LEO system. Well, it's because SpaceX, Elon Musk wants to build a colony on Mars, and the $8 billion launch industry, even if you own the whole thing, just isn't big enough,
Hmm.
in terms of revenue and cash generation to support a colony on Mars. OneWeb, forget the roots of the company when it was originally formed. Today, it has become a consortium of international players from Hanwha in South Korea to Bharti in India, the UK government. Now you've got France with Eutelsat, that are more committed to a traditional wholesale model and hence have a lot more support from the broader industry. Um, Amazon has their own set of criteria that they're focused on, which, yes, it's connectivity to the consumer and shipping more Amazon products, but there's also an internal requirement, right? They have dozens of telecom service providers globally. They can internalize and disaggregate a lot of those service providers if they can offer a very high throughput, low latency, edge computing capable, Kuiper system.
Hmm.
So from on that basis, perhaps they could justify it just based upon, internalizing costs. And there's other players out there. I won't go through the whole list, but you know, uh, although I say there's commodity reasons why there should only be one, I think there will end up being many.
Hopefully, that's better for the user in the end.
Yep,
So, right.
competition is good.
Exactly. Okay, so I want to end with one last question, and it really goes back to the Mobile Satellite Users Association that's hosting this session today. We are celebrating our 31st anniversary this year, and with that in mind, obviously we've seen a lot of changes over the last 30 years. What would be your prediction for the next 30 years in satellite?
So more people will be connected. I guess there'll be several LEO broadband systems. If I can go off the reservation a bit here, I personally think that we are going to see the development of a cislunar economy. I went out to the West Coast last year and went down through the LA area, and I saw companies doing, well, spin launch, a centrifugal launch of satellites, others that were building capsules that can manufacture pharmaceuticals and fiber optic cables in space,
Mhm.
small sat builders. I mean, you name it, the amount of innovation in startups. And a lot of it is built around things that are going to happen, out in cislunar. Cislunar being anything from LEO out to the moon. I think there's
Mhm.
60 to 80 missions going to the moon before the end of the decade. In fact, right now, as we speak, you have what could be the very first ever commercial lander from iSpace in Japan. It's on its way to the moon right now. It's a commercial mission. No, it's not a government.
Yeah.
So I get excited about what could happen there. The fundamental reason why this stuff makes sense today, whereas it didn't when I was a kid in the 1970s, is because the launch equation has been solved.
Right.
And not only the cost of launch. SpaceX has driven launch costs down by an order of magnitude. Starship is successful, maybe, 2 orders of magnitude, but it's also the access to space. So we've had 2 straight years of record historical launches, and that access, just the ability to get a ride, much less the cost, is changing the economic models that close in space. So where is the mobile satellite user association going to go in the next 30 years? Well, it's a lot of mobility in space.
Yeah.
It's communications on the moon and to the moon, and all the things that happen in that emerging space economy that Jeff Bezos says is going to have millions of people living and working in space and moving heavy industry into space. And there's a whole mobile communications problem that's got to get solved there.
Absolutely. Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to mark your words, and we'll have you back on as this becomes more and more of a reality. Chris, thank you so much for making time to be here today. If someone wanted to learn more about Quilty Analytics, where would they go?
I guess they'd go to my website, but it's terrible because I made it like 6 years ago and I haven't updated it. But we're coming out with an update. So, but certainly, Chris at quiltyanalytics.com. You can reach out to me directly, the website, LinkedIn, Twitter, and all that fun stuff.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I also want to take a moment to thank the Mobile Satellite Users Association for hosting these sessions. If you want to learn more about MSUA, please visit msua.org. And we do have our upcoming Satellite Mobile Innovation Awards that are happening during the satellite event in March in Washington, D.C. If you're going to be there, make sure to check that event out. And we'll see you next time on MSUA's Game Changers Live.